He stood in the open air of the agora with the weight of an office in his hands, and he gave it away. The ceremony would have been brief, as such things in Ephesus tended to be. Practical, witnessed, conducted in the specific filtered light of an Ionian morning when the sea air still carries the cold of the night before. Heraclitus, son of Bloson, holder of the hereditary title that entitled him to serve as Basileus, the ceremonial priest-king connected to the ancient cult of Demeter, performed the formal act of renunciation before his fellow citizens. He passed the office to his brother. Then he turned and walked and did not look back at the crowd watching him go. What that walk felt like, where it took him, what he thought as the distance grew between himself and the gathered faces of Ephesus, none of this is recorded. What remains is the act itself and the philosophical tradition that surrounds it, like water around a stone, and the long question of why a man of the ancient world would relinquish power that had been placed in his hands by birth, by lineage, by the accumulated weight of civic expectation. The simplest answer, and perhaps the truest, is that he did not believe in it. Not in the office, and not in the people who would have watched him hold it, and not in the kind of authority that derives its force from custom rather than from understanding. Ephesus in the late 6th century before the Common Era was a city that had learned to live inside contradiction. It sat on the western coast of Ionia, where the Aegean trade routes met the older roads of the interior, and its harbor received ships from Egypt and Phoenicia, and the Greek islands, and the eastern cities of Lydia, each one carrying goods and languages and habits of thought that did not always agree with one another. The city was Greek in its architecture and its festivals, and the elevated columns of the Temple of Artemis, which stood at its edge as one of the largest structures in the known world, a building so wide and so high that travelers described it for generations afterward in language that reached for superlatives and could not quite arrive. But Ephesus was also Lydian in its older administrative habits, and Persian in its recent political history. The Persian king Cyrus had swept through Ionia around 547 BCE, folding the region into his empire with a military efficiency that left the Greek cities intact but subordinate, and the cosmopolitan ease with which Ephesus absorbed this change was itself a kind of education in the nature of power, how it moved, how it transformed, how the city that had been one thing became another thing without entirely ceasing to be what it had been. A person of Heraclitus's disposition, sensitive to the deep structure beneath the visible surface of events, would have found his city a continuous philosophical provocation. Every ship that unloaded at the harbor brought evidence that the world was larger and stranger than any single tradition could contain. Every language spoken in the market named reality slightly differently. Every merchant who arrived from Persia or from Egypt or from the islands carried with him a different account of what the gods required, what justice meant, what distinguished a citizen from a slave. And the disagreements between these accounts were not marginal, but ran all the way down to the foundations of the questions themselves. He watched all of this, and he found most of it asleep. That is perhaps the phrase that best captures the Heraclitean disposition as it emerges through the fragments that survive him. The sense that the people moving through his city, trading and arguing and building temples and celebrating festivals, were engaged with the surface of experience without penetrating to the pattern moving through all of it. They lived in the world the way a person lives inside a familiar room, comfortable, habitual, undisturbed by the possibility that the walls they take for granted might be describing something more extraordinary than shelter. The crowd at the harbor saw trade goods, Heracliteans, watching beside them saw a demonstration of the same principle he saw in the river and in the fire and in the tension of a bowstring, the world continuously exchanging one form for another, while remaining, at a deeper level of organization, the same governing pattern expressing itself in different materials. He was born, as best the scholars can determine, somewhere around 535 BCE, which places his formation squarely inside the decades when the Persian consolidation of Ionia was reshaping the political landscape of every city on the Aegean coast. By the time he came to his full powers as a thinker, the Ionian revolt against Persian rule had broken and failed, an event that unfolded between 499 and 494 BCE, drawing in Athens and ending with the Persian burning of Miletus, the great intellectual city that had been home to Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, the thinkers who had started the project of explaining the world in terms of natural principles rather than divine intervention. Miletus, the city that had produced the first Greek philosophers, was destroyed within Heraclitus' probable lifetime. The cosmopolitan world of Ionian intellectual life, come the world in which a thinker like Heraclitus could find his philosophical predecessors and his counterexamples and his material, was being destabilized at its foundations by forces that had nothing to do with argument and everything to do with iron and fire and the movement of armies. Heraclitus's response to all of this was not grief and not nostalgia and not the kind of political engagement that would have required him to choose a side and work toward a specific outcome. His response was to sit with it until it became evidence. The turbulence, the conflict, the way the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states strained against each other across the whole width of Ionia. This was not, to his way of seeing, an aberration from the natural order of things. It was the natural order of things. The world ran on tension. Conflict was not what happened when harmony broke down. Conflict was the mechanism through which harmony maintained itself. This is a thought that requires a specific kind of patience to arrive at, and a specific kind of intellectual temperament to hold without flinching, and Heraclitus had both. He had also, by most accounts, a disposition towards solitude that the citizens of Ephesus found difficult, and the later philosophical tradition found both irritating and essential. He was known to spend time in the hills behind the city. He declined the invitations that civic life placed before him. When Darius, the Persian king, sent word inviting Heraclitus to visit his court, and Diogenes Laertius records this anecdote with the caveat that its historical reliability is uncertain. Though its consistency with everything else we know about Heraclitus is philosophically significant, the philosopher declined. The court of a foreign king was not a place where understanding would be easier to come by. The noise was different from the noise in the marketplace. The distance from the Logos was the same. The Ephesians themselves did not escape his assessment. When the city exiled Hermodorus, a citizen Heraclitus regarded as its most distinguished. The philosopher's response was recorded in a fragment that has the compression and the finality of all his best prose. The Ephesians deserve, every man of them, to be hanged for having exiled Hermodorus, the most useful man among them, saying, "We will not have any one be most useful among us. If there is such a one, let him go and be that somewhere else." This is not the language of a man who has made peace with democratic consensus. It is the language of a man who has looked at the practice of majority rule and found it, at its worst, a mechanism for eliminating the very quality of understanding it most needs to preserve. Whether the historical details of the Hermodorus episode are reliable in every particular is a question the scholars have turned over for centuries, without settling. What is clear is that this fragment sounds like Heraclitus. It carries the same impatience with collective mediocrity, the same preference for the singular and the perceptive over the numerous and the comfortable, the same contempt for the way institutions tend to protect their own averageness against the pressure that a genuinely uncommon mind creates in them. And so the anecdote, reliable or not in its details, tells us something true about the voice behind it. That voice came down to us in pieces, and the piecing together is itself a philosophical drama. Heraclitus wrote a single prose work, and he deposited it, according to one tradition, in the temple of Artemis, placing his thinking inside a religious institution whose premises he did not share, as if to say that the temple could keep the book safe without understanding it, and that the understanding would have to be assembled by whoever was serious enough to look. This gesture, if genuine, would be consistent with everything else we know about how he thought about the relationship between the many and the few. The book was there for anyone who wanted it, and almost no one would want it in the right way. The work did not survive intact. What remains are approximately 130 fragments, preserved because later writers quoted them in works that had their own purposes and their own survival stories. Each quotation embedded in a context that was not designed to protect Heraclitus's meaning, but to use it as evidence in arguments he never made. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, was a Christian apologist working to demonstrate that the Greeks had anticipated certain Christian truths, and he found Heraclitus useful for this purpose, quoting him in passages whose framing pulled the original toward theological positions Heraclitus would not have recognized. Hippolytus of Rome, also writing in the 3rd century, was engaged in refuting heresies, and he quarried Heraclitus for material that could be made to look like early error or early anticipation, depending on the argument at hand. Marcus Aurelius, writing 2 centuries after that, was a Roman emperor composing private philosophical notes to himself in Greek on military campaigns far from Rome, and when he returned to Heraclitus, it was as a resource for practical equanimity. Returning to the fragments, the way a person returns to a particular passage in a book they have carried for decades, finding in it what they need for the day at hand. Each of these transmitters left their mark. Each of them shaped what survived and how it arrived. The Heraclitus we read is therefore a collaborative construction, assembled across a millennium of quotation and misquotation and creative appropriation, which is not a misfortune we should wish had been otherwise, but a condition that is itself philosophically revealing. We encounter his philosophy the way we encounter a river, in glimpses, from different banks, at different hours, never holding the entire course from source to sea in a single view. What we know of the river is real. It is also partial, and the partiality is inseparable from the knowing. Consider for a moment the journey of a single sentence. Somewhere in the 3rd century of the Common Era, a scribe working in a scriptorum, perhaps in Alexandria, perhaps in Antioch, somewhere in the educated Eastern Mediterranean world, where Greek was still the language of philosophical discourse, was copying a text by Clement of Alexandria. Clement's Stromata, a wide-ranging work of early Christian philosophical theology, contained several passages in which Clement deployed Heraclitean phrases as part of his argument. The scribe's task was reproduction, not interpretation. He set down the letters one after another, his attention divided between the accuracy of the copying and the small physical demands of the work, the angle of the pen, the consistency of the ink, the management of the scroll or codex in front of him. In the act of that copying, without knowing it, He extended by several centuries the life of words that had first been spoken or written down in Ephesus some 800 years before. The scribe did not know the nature of his preservation. He was not thinking about Heraclitus. He was thinking about Clement, or perhaps about the quality of the afternoon light through the window above his desk, or about the meal that would follow the end of the work. But through the habitual practice of his craft, performed without philosophical intention, he became a link in a chain of transmission that neither he nor any other single person had designed or governed. The kind of chain that is the only way anything survives across the distances of time, dependent at every link on someone performing their ordinary work with ordinary care, and the survival of the whole depending on none of those links breaking at once. The fragments that arrived on the other side of this transmission are, when read together, recognizable as coming from a single mind. The voice is consistent. The compressed, paradoxical prose has a quality that resists imitation. It is not a style that any later writer simply borrowed or reproduced, because the style is inseparable from the philosophical claim, which is that the truth is hidden inside contradiction and cannot be stated simply without being falsified. Every later writer who transmitted a fragment of Heraclitus transmitted the difficulty along with the content, whether they wanted to or not. Antiquity called him Hoskotenos, the obscure, the dark one. The name was not a compliment, exactly, though it was not offered as dismissal either. It named something real about the experience of reading him, the sense of pressing against a prose that will not yield itself easily, that holds its meaning at one remove from any straightforward approach, that requires the reader to stop and hold two apparently contradictory things together, rather than resolving the contradiction in favor of one of its sides. An ancient reader coming to Heraclitus for the first time would have encountered, in the very texture of the prose, something designed to resist the kind of reading that runs smoothly from sentence to sentence, collecting information and moving on. This was not carelessness. It was not the obscurity of a thinker who had not thought clearly enough to write clearly. Heraclitus wrote the way he did because he understood something about the relationship between form and content, that a truth which depends on the coexistence of opposites, on the recognition that the world maintains its coherence through tension rather than through resolution, cannot be delivered in prose that resolves all its tensions on the reader's behalf. The difficulty is the philosophy, given a body. The reader who struggles with the prose is not failing to understand Heraclitus. The reader who struggles and does not look away is beginning to understand him in the only way the understanding is available. Ancient readers who encountered the name Hoskotenos for the first time would have paused over it, the way a reader pauses over an unexpected word in a passage they thought they had followed, uncertain whether the darkness referred to a failure, a man who could not be understood because he had not done the work of being understood, or to a depth so considerable that ordinary light did not reach it, and that the shadow cast by the thinking was not the shadow of confusion, but the shadow of something genuinely large, standing between the reader and the sun. The name holds both possibilities at once, and Heraclitus would have found this appropriate. He spent what appears to have been much of his adult life in deliberate withdrawal from the social world that Ephesus offered. The philosophers before him, the Malassian thinkers who had begun the project of natural explanation that he was now extending and transforming, had mostly been engaged men connected to their city's public lives, men for whom philosophical inquiry was continuous with civic participation. Heraclitus made a different choice. The biography is thin and partly legendary, but the fragments are dense with the implication of solitude. of someone who had spent long hours alone with a problem that required the silence to develop. When he went up into the hills above the city, as tradition says he sometimes did, it was presumably because the hills offered something the market, and the agora did not. Not absence of stimulus, but the right kind of stimulus. The hills had the Caister River moving through them. They had fire if he wanted it. They had the sky, which cycled through its opposites with the regularity of a proof. At the harbor, the world he half despised and half understood lay visible in its full complexity. Ships from the Cyclades brought wine and marble. Ships from Phoenicia brought cedar and dye, and the particular quality of Levantine bronze that Ionian craftsmen preferred for certain kinds of work. Egyptian grain arrived in sacks that were unloaded by men speaking languages that Heraclitus understood only in part, who laughed at things he did not laugh at, who made gestures of greeting that carried meanings his own cultural grammar had not prepared him to receive. The harbor was, in this sense, the best argument in Ephesus for the view that the world was not governed by any single human account of it, that behind all the different languages and customs and trade goods and religious practices, something else was organizing the exchange, something common, something that the many, engaged in the surface of the transaction, could not see because they were inside it. He stood there, watching the unloading, and he was alone in a crowd of people who were also alone, each in their private account of what the world was, each inhabiting a separately constructed version of the shared scene. This is what he would later write about, in prose so compressed that later readers would need to slow down almost to the point of stopping to hold it. The paradox of a logos that is common to all things and known properly to almost none of them, passing through every transaction and every breath and every turning of the seasons, while the people it passes through remain absorbed in their partial and private versions of reality. The temple behind him was one version of the attempt to name the pattern. The priests who moved through its forecourt in the early hours before the city fully woke were working with a grammar of sacrifice and ceremony that had embedded within it an intuition that the world was ordered, that the order could be approached, that the approach required discipline and regularity. Heraclitus did not share their grammar. He had, in a concrete and public act, renounced the version of that grammar that was offered to him by birth. But the underlying intuition that there was a pattern, that the pattern was accessible to the right quality of attention, that most people were failing to attend in the right way, this he held in common with the priests, even if everything about his method of holding it was different. He went home and he wrote, or perhaps he sat in the hills and found the sentences arriving the way hard-thought sentences always arrive, slowly, in pieces, each one requiring the earlier ones to settle before the next would come. The prose that resulted was, by any measure, among the strangest philosophical writing that survives from antiquity. Not strange in the way that indicates confusion or excess, but strange in the way that indicates a mind that had seen something and was choosing deliberately to present it in the form that most faithfully represented the difficulty of seeing it. Every sentence that survives from Heraclitus is a small exercise in the kind of attention he was trying to produce. The reader must hold still, must resist the impulse to resolve, must allow the contradiction to remain long enough that the hidden harmony within it begins to become visible. He set down what he had written. He offered it no explanation. The explanation would have been a gift to readers who had not done the work of encountering the difficulty, and such readers were, in his considered estimate, the majority, the minority, the few who could hold the tension, who could stand in the contradiction, the way a person stands in cold water until the cold becomes simply the temperature of the world, would find in the lack of explanation not abandonment, but something closer to respect. A sentence that explains itself respects the reader's comfort. A sentence that withholds explanation respects the reader's capacity. What remains of this one man's lifetime of thinking arrived in our possession through the most contingent and unreliable of vehicles. The writing that Clement quoted was not written to transmit Heraclitus. The scholarship that Hippolytus performed was not designed to preserve what it preserved. The private notes that Marcus Aurelius kept were not written for publication and were not intended as a contribution to the philosophical record. The fragments survived because they were useful to people pursuing different ends, and that usefulness was itself a kind of accident that philosophy did not arrange and could not have predicted. Think of the shape of what survives. Not a complete argument with its premises and its steps and its conclusions arranged in the order that makes the logical structure visible. Not a sustained exposition that introduces a position and defends it against objections and arrives at a defended conclusion. What remains is something closer to a demolished wall, its stones scattered across a field, each stone real and solid and bearing the marks of the mason who shaped it, but the original structure available only through inference, through the work of imagining what a wall composed of these particular stones would have looked like when it stood. Some philosophers would find this condition a reason for frustration, the sense that what we have is too partial, too fragmentary, too far from its original form to permit reliable interpretation. Heraclitus himself might have found it appropriate. A philosophy that holds the incomplete to be not a failure of completion, but a revelation of the processes by which completion was assembled and disassembled. Such a philosophy is, in a certain light, better served by its survival in fragments than it would have been by a complete and intact text. The river of his thinking reaches us in glimpses. We wade into it at different points. We never hold the entire course. And in this way, the experience of reading him faithfully enacts the epistemological condition he was describing. The truth is there. It is moving through everything, and the most honest relationship with it is one that acknowledges the partiality of the view from the bank, while continuing to look. There is a kind of encounter that a finished system cannot provide. A finished system presents itself as complete. Here is the argument. Here are the supporting considerations. Here is the conclusion that follows. The encounter is governed by the structure the author built, and the reader moves through it on the path the author laid. A fragment offers something different. A fragment presents itself as partial, as requiring something from the reader, as incomplete in a way that cannot be remedied by more reading because the rest of the text is not coming. The reader must remain in the incompleteness, must hold the fragment without the comfort of context, without the permission to wait for the explanation that will arrive 3 paragraphs later, must accept that this stone, this shaped and specific stone from Heraclitus's demolished wall, is what there is, and that what there is enough to begin with. The honest encounter with an incomplete thing does not resolve into the satisfaction of a completed argument, but it opens a space that the completed argument closes. The question stays open. The stone stays visible in the field, shaped and real, and waiting for the attention that will find, in its particular cut and weight, more of the original wall than the stone itself contains, finding it in the act of looking, which is itself a kind of thinking, which is the only kind that serves. The night settles over Ephesus. The harbor is quieter now. The last trade goods long unloaded, the ships rocking at their moorings in the dark water of the Caister estuary. In the hills above the city, if we follow the tradition that places him there, a man who has declined a throne and insulted a king, and written sentences designed to resist easy understanding, is sitting with his thinking in the dark. The temple of Artemis holds its enormous columns against the sky, its priests perhaps still moving through their regulated patterns, the ceremony of the night hours proceeding according to the grammar he renounced. The fragments he will leave behind are not yet fragments. They are still a book, intact, deposited in the temple, or completed, or still being composed. They are still whole. The wholeness will not last. Nothing does. The book will move through time, the way everything moves through time, transformed by each transmission, shaped by each new context, reduced by each loss, preserved only in pieces by the accidents of later use. And what arrives on the other side of all that transformation, scattered and partial and demanding, will carry within it precisely the quality that Heraclitus spent his life pointing toward, the truth that an incomplete thing, encountered honestly and without the demand that it be other than what it is, opens a way of seeing that a finished and explained and resolved account was never going to find. The stones lie in the field. They are still shaped. They still bear, in their particular cut, the marks of the thinking that formed them. The wall is not there, and the wall is everywhere, in every patient attempt to imagine, from these surviving fragments, the structure that once held them, and in the recognition that the imagining, however careful, will always remain an approximation of something that has been moving, like everything else, since the moment it was made. In the 4th century of the Common Era, in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, a bishop named Eusebius sat assembling a work of enormous scope, a preparation for the gospel, a gathering of everything in Greek philosophy that might be made to point toward Christian truth. He was not, primarily, a philosopher. He was a custodian, a collector of useful inheritances, and among the texts he drew upon was a compendium assembled by a scholar named Arius Didymus, who had himself been working from sources now entirely lost. Eusebius opened that compendium, found a passage attributed to a philosopher who had been dead for 8 centuries, and copied it into his own pages without particular ceremony. The passage read, in the Greek that Heraclitus had first compressed into a single sentence, that upon those who step into the same rivers, different and again different waters flow. 700 years had passed between the mouth that first shaped those words and the hand that now transcribed them. The chain held by the thinnest of threads across the whole width of the ancient world. There is something in that chain worth sitting with before the argument inside the fragment is even approached. Arius Didymus no longer survives as a whole text. We know him only through the passages Eusebius chose to borrow, and we know Heraclitus almost entirely through similar acts of borrowing, each one made for a purpose other than pure preservation, each one a little crooked with the angle of the borrower's own concerns. The fragment arrives not as a clean transmission, but as a thing that has passed through several minds, each of them reading it through the particular light of their own moment, before it arrives in the form that can be read now. The river carrying the fragment is itself a river of the kind the fragment describes, never exactly the same water, always recognizably the same river. And yet here it is, different and again different waters, still the same sentence, the identity persisting precisely through the change. The fragment, as Arius Didymus preserved it, and as Eusebius passed it along, is careful in a way that translation tends to smooth away. Heraclitus does not say the river changes. He says that different waters flow upon those who step in. The grammar moves the instability to the water, and holds the river itself in a peculiar middle position, neither declared stable nor declared unstable, but named as the thing over which the changing waters flow. The river persists, the waters do not, and the paradox the sentence encodes is not that the river is an illusion of permanence concealing radical change. The paradox is subtler and stranger. The river's persistence and the water's change are not in tension with each other. They are the same fact seen from two angles. The river is the river because the water keeps moving. The identity is the process, not the substrate. What holds is not any particular water, but the pattern of the flowing. This distinction matters more than it first appears to. To say the river is secretly impermanent is the comfortable philosophical position, the one that warns against attachment by pointing out that nothing really stays. But the Heraclitean claim is not the comfortable position. It is not that the river is more temporary than it looks. It is that the river is exactly as permanent as it appears, and that this permanence is constituted entirely by impermanence. The same waters do not make it the same river. Different waters do. This is not reassurance wrapped in impermanence. This is something harder to hold and slower to digest. One figure who tried to hold it and found it too hot for his hands was a philosopher named Cratylus, who had been a student in Athens and had spent time with Heraclitean ideas in his youth. What Cratylus heard in the river fragment was not the careful paradox about identity and process. What he heard was the more alarming possibility hiding inside it. If the river is never quite the same river, and if the same is true of all things, and if this is true fast enough, not slowly across centuries, but immediately, in the interval between the forming of a thought and the speaking of it, then the problem is not merely that rivers change. The problem is that language cannot catch the world. By the time the word leaves the mouth, the thing it names has already moved. Every true statement is, at the moment of its utterance, already slightly false. Aristotle reports in the Metaphysics that Cratylus eventually concluded that even to say nothing was to say too much, to speak was to claim, and to claim was to pin down what could not be pinned. He stopped speaking. He communicated only by pointing with a single extended finger at the jar, at the window, at the face across the room, as though the gesture of indication was the only honest response to a world that language was always a step behind. This is a conclusion that follows from Heraclitean premises, but it is a conclusion Heraclitus himself did not reach, and the distance between them is worth holding as its own kind of light. Heraclitus wrote. He wrote in sentences so compressed they required readers to hold contradictions simultaneously. Yes, but they were sentences. He did not fall silent. He made the opposite choice. He made the difficulty of language part of the philosophical work, writing in a style dense enough that the effort of reading it was itself an argument about the gap between words and what words reach toward. The opacity of his prose was not a failure of expression. It was, by the evidence of everything attributed to him, a decision. Language cannot fully catch the world, and so he gave his readers language that could not be fully caught. The reader was left in the same position as the person in the river, inside a current they could feel, but not entirely name. Cratylus, pointing his silent finger, was pointing at the same problem, but where Heraclitus made art of the difficulty, Cratylus made it a dead end. And the dead end that Cratylus reached is itself philosophically instructive. The way a path that runs into stone tells the traveler something true about the terrain. The stone it ran into was this: if nothing can be accurately named at the moment of naming, then the act of pointing is also already too late. The finger extends toward the jar, and in the small interval between the decision to point and the gesture completing itself, the jar has changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but by the logic of absolute flux, changed nonetheless. Cratylus had applied the river doctrine with full consistency, and the result was a position that could not speak for itself. It required a follower of Aristotle to describe it. And the irony of that the most radical Heraclitean position can only be transmitted through the words of someone else, through a language Cratylus had declared impossible, is the kind of irony that the original river fragment seems to have anticipated all along. Plato was young when he encountered Heraclitean ideas through Cratylus, and what Plato felt reading them, or so the internal evidence of his dialogues suggests, was the simultaneous pull of their truth and the alarm of their consequences. In the dialogue he would later write and name after his teacher, Cratylus becomes a character through whom Plato examines what follows if everything in the sensory world is genuinely and continuously in flux. The argument in that dialogue is careful, patient, and ultimately pointed in a specific direction. If everything one can touch and taste and see is always flowing, then the kind of knowledge that requires stable, repeatable objects, the knowledge that can be spoken truly once and remain true when spoken again, must have objects of a different kind. Not sensory objects, not things that flow, things that hold their shape across time, because they are not in time in the same way. Plato was beginning to think in the pressure of the river's current toward what he would eventually call the forms. The river pushed him there. The flux that Heraclitus had described as the truth of all sensory things became in the dialogue named for the man who had taken that flux to its extreme, the very problem that a new kind of philosophy was needed to solve. Whether Plato solved the problem or merely relocated it to a different level is a question the philosophical tradition has not settled. But the generative pressure of the river is visible in every page of the Cratylus, and it is worth holding that image clearly. Heraclitean instability was not the position Plato overcame. It was the pressure under which Platonic philosophy took its specific shape. The river did not merely flow, it carved the channel that later philosophy ran through. A person standing in that river today, standing ankle-deep in shallow, clear water at dusk, holding perfectly still and watching the current part around their foot and rejoin itself downstream, can feel both claims at once in a way that argument alone struggles to convey. The cold water that arrives at the foot is not the same water that was there a moment ago. The water that leaves, curling around and continuing forward, will never return to this exact position. And yet the river has a name. The river was here yesterday. The river will be here tomorrow in a way that this particular water will not. The name refers to something real. The continuity is genuine. The river is the river, and the river is never exactly the river, and both of these are true, and they require each other. What a foot standing in a river knows, a mind taking Heraclitus seriously, is asked to know without the foot. The body in the water has the advantage of receiving both truths simultaneously, through cold and current, and the physical sensation of something always arriving and always departing. The mind working through argument tends to want to choose, to decide whether the river's identity is real, or whether the impermanence is real, as though one must cancel the other. The fragment holds both open. It does not resolve into comfort. It holds the open structure of the paradox and asks the reader to live inside it, the way one lives inside a river, not by resolving the current, but by standing in it and letting it teach. Contemporary philosophers working in what is called process ontology have returned to this problem with tools Heraclitus did not have, and reached conclusions that the river fragment seems to have been waiting for. The question is this: what kind of thing is the river, if neither the substance view, the river is fundamentally the water in it, nor the illusion view, the river is only a name we give to an ongoing change, quite captures what the fragment describes? The answer these philosophers have developed is that the river is a pattern, not a static pattern like a design stamped on cloth, but a dynamic pattern, a specific shape of change, a particular way of relating input and output, a form that persists through transformation because it is a transformation and not a thing that undergoes transformation. The river is not a noun that happens to have a verb inside it. The river is a verb that has been given a noun's name for convenience. Its identity is not a thing that endures despite the flowing. Its identity is the flowing, taken as a whole in its characteristic shape. This view, that events and relations and processes are more fundamental to what exists than static substances, finds in Heraclitus not a primitive forerunner, still lacking the vocabulary for a better idea, but an early thinker who had already located the philosophically significant claim. The river fragment is not waiting to be corrected by Plato, or refined by Aristotle, or explained by process philosophy. It is doing something of its own, in its own register, with its own kind of precision. The precision is compressed, even cryptic, but the compression is intentional, and the cryptic quality is part of what it is trying to say about what language can and cannot hold. There is also the simpler version of the fragment, the version most people encounter first, the one that sounds as though Heraclitus himself said it, that one cannot step into the same river twice. This version is clean and memorable, and has become, across centuries of popular transmission, the sentence most associated with Heraclitean flux. But scholars have traced it not to Heraclitus, but to Cratylus, and the two versions, read side by side, are not the same claim. The Cratylian version draws a hard conclusion. It declares the river permanently and completely different with each contact. The Heraclitean version is more careful, more paradoxical, more interested in holding two truths in one sentence than in landing on one clean truth at the expense of the other. Different, and again different waters flow, and the river, named across those waters, persists. Both truths are there, in the same sentence, pulling against each other and making something that neither alone could make. The confusion between the two versions is philosophically generative in its own right. For centuries, readers have heard the Cratylian conclusion and attributed it to Heraclitus, and have then read the more nuanced original version in the light of the simpler one, finding there an impermanence doctrine more absolute than the text quite supports. This is itself a kind of river problem, the text changing as it passes through different readers, each one receiving a slightly different current, none of them quite the same as the original. That the philosophical tradition has been arguing about which version is the authentic one is in its small way a demonstration of what both versions are describing. The text flows, the interpretation changes. The river, named across all that change, persists under the name Heraclitus. A scholar in the 3rd century before the Common Era, copying the fragment from an older source onto a fresh scroll, may not have known they were doing anything more than routine transmission, the kind of careful, quiet work that keeps a philosophical tradition alive from one generation to the next. The ink they used would dry and crack in time. The scroll they wrote on would soften and darken and eventually lose its legibility. The room they worked in, its particular quality of morning light, the sounds of the city beyond the walls, the smell of the library in warm weather, is entirely beyond recovery. And yet the act of copying, that unhurried movement of a stylus over papyrus, was itself an act of the kind the river fragment describes. Something was preserved through change. Something was maintained not despite the passing of time, but through the accumulated acts of engagement that time permitted. The fragment survived not by standing still, but by being repeatedly carried forward into new containers, each slightly different from the last, each changing what it held and being changed by it. The scroll would decay, but before it did, another hand would copy from it, and from that copy, another, and the chain would hold, imperfectly and miraculously, across Hellenistic libraries and Roman collections and Byzantine monasteries, and the shelves of Christian scholars with agendas of their own, until Eusebius sat in Caesarea in the 4th century and wrote it into a text designed to argue for something Heraclitus had never imagined. The river of transmission carried its own different, and again different waters, and delivered something that can still be read. What can be read, in the fragment as preserved, is not a doctrine of loss. This point is worth dwelling on, because the word impermanence carries with it, in most of its common uses, the shadow of grief, the awareness that what one holds will eventually be released, that what is loved will pass, that the beautiful thing is already moving toward its end. The river fragment does not inhabit that shadow. It is not a meditation on how things do not stay. It is a meditation on how staying is itself a form of going. The river stays by going. Its persistence is a particular kind of motion. What Heraclitus observed in the river was not impermanence as loss, but impermanence as structure, the mechanism by which identity is not destroyed by change, but constituted through it. The grief that readers sometimes bring to the river fragment is real, and it belongs to them, and it is not wrong to feel it, but the fragment does not invite it. The fragment does not stand at the edge of the water and mourn. It stands at the edge of the water and observes with a quality of attention so precise and steady that the paradox resolves, not into comfort, but into clarity. The river is what it is because it keeps flowing. This is not a consolation, it is a description. And descriptions, in Heraclitus, are expected to do more philosophical work than explanations, because they show the structure of the thing without reducing it to something smaller and tidier than the thing is. Plato, sitting in a garden with Heraclitean fragments, young still, Socrates recently dead, the hemlock recently administered, and already historical, may have felt the pull of the river's truth, and also clearly the need for something that the river could not provide, something that did not flow, something that could be the same object of knowledge, regardless of when it was considered, something whose truth did not expire before the sentence asserting it could be finished. The theory of forms grew from many pressures, and Heraclitean flux was among them, a pressure that did not produce the forms as its logical conclusion, but that made the philosophical need for something like the forms felt acutely and unmistakably by a young man who had just lost his teacher and who needed, among other things, the assurance that what Socrates had known was still true and still worth knowing even now that Socrates was gone. Whether Plato was right to reach for the forms and whether the forms solve the problem Heraclitean flux poses is a question that runs through the center of the Western philosophical tradition and has not found its resting place. But the river generated the question. The observation of the river, held long enough and seriously enough, produced the pressure that shaped one of the great systematic philosophies of the ancient world. This is not a small thing to say about a single sentence preserved through 700 years of imperfect transmission. The river, seen from above at nightfall, does not look as though it is doing anything urgent. The surface, in fading light, takes on a quality of stillness that is entirely deceptive. The current is there beneath it, steady, substantial, carrying everything that has entered it forward and downstream and away. The stones on the bottom shift slowly. The banks hold their shape against the ongoing argument of the water. The fish move in the middle depth in ways that are governed by the current even when they swim against it. Everything in the river is in motion, and from above, in failing light, it looks like a dark and patient surface, calm as glass. There is a quality of attention that the river, considered long enough, begins to produce in those who sit beside it. It is not melancholy. It is not the kind of alertness that requires effort. It is closer to the condition a mind enters when it has stopped insisting on a resolution and has begun simply to observe, when the need to stabilize the world into fixed and nameable things has quieted enough that the world can be perceived in its actual character, which includes both the pattern and the motion, both the name and the current it names. Heraclitus sat beside many rivers. He observed them with a quality of attention fine enough to produce, eventually, a sentence that held the paradox of their nature in 20 words or fewer. He did not resolve the paradox, he preserved it. What Heraclitus found in the river was not a lesson about how to accept the passing of things. The fragment is not a consolation for loss, and it was not intended as one. What he found was a description of how identity actually works in a world where nothing holds still. The identity of the river is not a thing added to the flowing water to make it a river, rather than a random succession of liquid moments. The identity is in the pattern of the flowing, the specific character of how this water moves through this channel in this direction, gathering from these tributaries and emptying toward the sea. The river is the river the way a flame is itself, not because it is made of fixed materials, but because it maintains a particular form of transformation, a characteristic way of being in motion. To know the river, then, is not to find the still center beneath the moving surface. There is no still center. To know the river is to know the motion as it is, as a specific, coherent, continuous kind of becoming. This is what the river asks of anyone willing to stand in it long enough, to stop feeling for the solid bottom and begin to feel the current itself, to let the cold and moving water define the terms of the encounter, rather than waiting for it to settle into something manageable. Different, and again different waters. The same river, both at once, the patience to hold both without choosing. Somewhere in the hours after all the watchers have gone, the river continues. No one is counting its waters. No one is testing whether this moment's water is the same as the last moment's, or whether the river has kept its name through all the darkness and all the flow. The river does not need to be watched to be the river. It keeps the pattern of its going in the dark, in the cold, without witness, the water different, and again different, the river entirely itself, the current holding everything in its moving and delivering it, unheld and unhurried, toward the open water it has always been approaching. The fragment does not ask for anything from the one who reads it. It does not invite resolution. It asks only that the river be allowed to be what it is, a thing whose persistence is a form of motion, whose identity is a pattern held in water that is never twice the same water. This is a thing the mind, in its more open moments, can hold without effort and without strain. The river keeps moving, the pattern holds, the waters are always different and always arriving. Around 300 BCE, a young man named Zeno arrived in Athens carrying very little, some cargo, some money, most of it lost in a shipwreck off the Aegean coast, and made his way to a bookseller's stall on the edge of the agora. He was from Citium, a city on the eastern coast of Cyprus, and he had not come to Athens to buy books. He had come because the shipwreck had redirected him, and he was the kind of person who paid attention to redirection. The bookseller was reading aloud from a scroll. Zeno stopped. The scroll contained accounts of Socrates, the long, patient, circuit-riding conversations of a man who had spent his life asking what virtue was and never claimed to have found it. Zeno sat down on a stool in the stall, and by the time the bookseller had finished reading, something had shifted. He asked where he could find men like the one in the scroll. The bookseller pointed toward a man walking past in the street outside, and Zeno followed him, and that following became the beginning of Stoic philosophy. Among the texts Zeno carried and studied in those early years in Athens were fragments of Heraclitus. He had not invented his interest in that philosopher. It was already old by his time, already 3 centuries of commentary and argument and misreading and careful recovery. But what Zeno found in those fragments was not an antiquarian curiosity. It was something that felt like a description of the world as it actually behaved. There was in Heraclitus a claim about fire. Not fire as one element among 4, not fire as a symbol or a metaphor loosely applied, but fire as a name for the way the cosmos organizes itself, the way it regulates its own exchanges, maintains its own proportions, consumes and releases, and holds itself in a balance that is never static and never lost. Zeno read this, and the reading did not end when he set the scroll down. Heraclitus had written that the cosmos is an ever-living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. The phrase carries more weight than it seems to at first. It does not say the cosmos is made of fire, the way a house is made of timber, static material, awaiting the form imposed on it from outside. It says the cosmos is fire in its activity, fire as a process, fire as the manner in which the world continually exchanges itself with itself. What a flame does, consuming, transforming, releasing heat and light, drawing on what surrounds it, giving back something different from what it takes. This was, for Heraclitus, not a figure of speech, but a direct description of what existence does at every level and in every direction, without pause, and with a precision he called the logos. The word logos is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. In the Greek of Heraclitus's time, it carried the full weight of at least 4 meanings simultaneously, and Heraclitus appears to have intended all of them at once. It meant speech, the articulated word. It meant reason, the faculty of ordered thinking. It meant account, in the sense of a reckoning that can be given for something. It meant proportion, a mathematical relationship holding one quantity in ratio to another. Heraclitus chose this word not because he was being imprecise, but because he was insisting on a particular kind of precision, the kind that refuses to split the structure of the cosmos from the structure of language that can describe it. The logos is what the cosmos is, and it is also what a clear enough mind can say about it. These 2 things are not separate. They run along the same grain. He begins his work with a statement that has spent 2,500 years being translated and discussed and disputed and quietly held in the minds of people who have never heard his name. He opens by saying that although the logos is common, the many live as if they had a private understanding. The sentence is short. It takes less than 3 seconds to say aloud, but the thing it contains has enough room in it to walk around in for an evening and not reach the far wall. The logos is common, meaning it belongs to everyone, shared the way the air is shared, the way the morning is shared, moving through all things without exception, available without purchase or privilege or special training. And yet the many live as if they had a private understanding, not a different understanding, a private one. The delusion Heraclitus is describing is not that people are wrong in their conclusions. It is that they have retreated into a smaller and more personal version of the world and taken up residence there, and they mistake the smaller version for the whole. The diagnosis is gentle in its way, even if its delivery was not. Heraclitus was not a gentle man by any account that survives, but the condition he is describing, the retreat into private interpretation, the substitution of habit for attention, the preference for the familiar arrangement of things over the arrangement things actually have. This condition is understandable. It is what the mind does when it is not pressed otherwise. It settles. It finds the patterns it already knows. It stops asking whether the patterns it knows are the patterns that are there. There is a word in one of the fragments for this state of settled inattention. Heraclitus says the many are absent while present. He means this precisely. The body is in the world, walking through the market, watching the ships come in, feeling the cold of the harbor air. But the attention is elsewhere, housed in its private language, turning the world into a confirmation of what it already believes. To be present in the body while absent in attention, this was, for Heraclitus, the ordinary condition of most people, most of the time, and the gap between that ordinary condition and the life lived in contact with the Logos was the central philosophical problem of his work. He reaches for another image to make this felt. He says that the many are like sleepers, each inhabiting a private dream world, while the waking world they could share remains outside the dream, available but untouched. This image has stayed in the philosophical tradition long after his name has faded from ordinary conversation, because it names something recognizable. The sleeper in the dream is not unconscious. The sleeper is busy. Dreaming is active work, vivid and emotionally engaging, and full of its own internal logic. What the sleeper lacks is not intensity, but contact. The dream is coherent on its own terms and disconnected from everything outside those terms. This, Heraclitus is saying, is what most human understanding looks like from the outside: coherent, active, engaged, and deeply consistently asleep to the Logos moving through it. The remedy he proposes is not more information. He is not interested in correcting specific beliefs or substituting better facts for worse ones. The problem is not in the content of what people know, but in the quality of attention they bring to the world as it is. Something must shift, not in what the mind holds, but in how it holds, not in the arguments it has mastered, but in whether it remains open to what is actually moving through the things the arguments are about. This quality of attention, turned outward, patient, willing to find the world more organized than expected, and differently organized than assumed, is the closest Heraclitus comes to prescribing a practice, and it is not a technique. It is more like a decision to stop insisting. Zeno of Citium read all of this. He sat with it for years in Athens, carrying it alongside the Socratic conversations he had encountered on that first afternoon in the bookseller's stall. What he found in the combination was the outline of a philosophy that would eventually become Stoicism, though Zeno would not have called it that. The name came later, from the painted porch, the Stoa Poicola, where he taught. The Logos of Heraclitus became, in Zeno's hands and in the hands of those who followed him, something called the pneuma. The pneuma was fire-like, breath-like, a substance so subtle it was more like a quality than a material, a rational warmth threading through the body of the cosmos, the way warmth threads through a body that is alive and present, and withdrawing when what was alive becomes what is no longer. The cosmos, for Zeno, was not a collection of objects. It was a living thing organized from within by the same rational fire that Heraclitus had named. Clinthus of Assos succeeded Zeno as the head of this school. He was a man who had worked as a water carrier and a boxer to afford his education, who spent his nights studying after laboring through his days, whose relationship to philosophy was not comfortable, but hard-earned and closely held. Cleanthes wrote a hymn to Zeus, in which Zeus and the Logos, and the fire that governs all things, are addressed as aspects of a single reality, something that has no edge, that pervades what is small and what is enormous with equal thoroughness, that sets the proportions of the seasons and the exchanges of the elements and the grammar of a well-reasoned argument by the same underlying law. It is Heraclitean fire translated into prayer, which means it is also Heraclitean fire translated into something that can be practiced, returned to, made into a rhythm of daily life. Chrysippus of Soli came after Cleanthes, and where Cleanthes was a poet and a laborer, Chrysippus was a systematizer, one of those minds that cannot rest until every element of an idea has been traced to its root and every implication has been followed to its end. He wrote, by some accounts, over 700 books, most of them lost. What survives is a portrait of a philosopher who took the Heraclitean insight that the cosmos operates by a rational fire principle and constructed from it an entire account of how nature coheres, how language works, how ethics is grounded, how the virtuous person relates to the whole of things. The logos spermaticos, the generative rational seed embedded in all things, was Chrysippus's formulation, drawn from Heraclitean fire, but organized into an architecture so elaborate it could support a full philosophical school for centuries. Later thinkers, encountering Stoicism after the Hellenistic world had aged into the Roman one, would find in this architecture not an ancient curiosity, but a working description of how to live when the world is not cooperating. Somewhere in the 2nd century CE, a man named Marcus Aurelius was given the most powerful office in the Roman world and discovered that power offered very little of what made a life bearable. The empire was large and difficult and constantly threatened from the north and east. His children died. His generals were unreliable. The administration required daily decisions that affected millions of people, most of whom he would never see. He was a thoughtful man, trained in philosophy from his youth, earnest about it in a way that coexisted in him without awkwardness alongside the business of governing. He wrote notes to himself. He did not write them for publication. They were a private discipline, a daily return to the things that steadied him, and what steadied him most was the thought of the Logos, the rational fire moving through all of it, through the campaigns on the Danube frontier, and the deaths of the people he had loved, and the long grinding administrative work of a power he had not sought and could not set down. He writes, all things are changing, and you yourself are in continuous mutation, and in a manner in continuous destruction, and the world too. The sentence is not elegant in the way a polished literary sentence is elegant. It is honest in the way a private note is honest, written toward the thing, not around it, with no audience to manage, and it carries Heraclitean fire directly, without mediation. The world is in continuous change. The person writing the note is in continuous change. The destruction is real, the old form always passing into something else, the familiar arrangement never remaining long enough to be held, and the response Marcus Aurelius arrives at, again and again across the 12 books of what he writes, is not grief and not denial. It is something closer to alignment. If the Logos governs the change, if the change is not chaos but exchange, not loss but transformation, not noise but the measured kindling and going out of a fire that has not yet and will not soon be extinguished, then the appropriate response is not to resist, but to attend, to watch the exchange clearly, to find, in the watching, not comfort exactly, but something steadier than comfort, something that does not depend on the exchanged things remaining. It is possible to read Marcus Aurelius and not find the Stoic philosophy in him directly. He does not often argue for his positions, he returns to them. The same image appears again in slightly different light on a different day. Turned in the hand, the way a person turns a coin they have been carrying for years, not examining it for new information, but maintaining contact with what it represents. The logos comes back, the fire comes back, the image of the river comes back, the recognition that what is passing is not being destroyed, but transformed, comes back and comes back again, and the returning is itself the practice, not a conclusion reached once and then remembered, but a quality of attention sustained by repetition, by the deliberate choice to notice the change, rather than be used by the desire that the change not happen. There is something in this that requires being said carefully. The Heraclitian diagnosis of human inattention, the many absent while present, the many asleep in their private worlds, could sound like a criticism that carries sting. But in the hands of Marcus Aurelius, and in the grain of the Stoic tradition that carried Heraclitean fire forward, it functions differently. The sleepers are not condemned. The dreamers are not dismissed. The private world is what the mind makes when it is doing what minds naturally do, which is to organize experience into something manageable and to rest in the organization once it is made. That this resting in organization is not the same as being in contact with the Logos. This is simply a description, not a judgment. The correction it calls for is not self-reproach, but something more like turning toward an open window that was already there, which costs nothing except the willingness to turn. The flame Heraclitus chose as his central image is worth staying with, because the choice was not arbitrary. Fire does what the Logos does. It maintains its form entirely through the process of change. The flame is recognizably a flame from one moment to the next, and there is no moment in which it contains the same material it contained one moment before. The form persists. The substance exchanges itself continuously. This is not a paradox to be resolved. It is a description of how identity actually works at every level. Heraclitus examined, in rivers, in flames, in persons, in the cosmos as a whole. The thing that persists is the pattern. The pattern is what the Logos is, and the pattern is most visible precisely where the change is most obvious, in fire, in water, in the turning of the seasons, in the way a life changes from one decade to the next while remaining in some way recognizable as itself. A small lamp burning alone on a hillside above Ephesus would have been visible from a considerable distance on a clear night, a point of warm light against a dark sky, steady enough to navigate by, small enough to extinguish in a breath. It consumes the oil evenly. It gives off heat and light in proportions that remain essentially constant as long as the oil holds. Nothing in it is still. The wick chars, and the oil depletes, and the heat moves outward through the air in all directions, and the light moves outward at a different rate, and the air around the air flame is warmed and rises and pulls cooler air in from below, and the whole arrangement maintains itself through this continuous circulation, and at any moment looked at from a few feet away, it is simply a flame, recognizable, steady, present, governed by measures it did not choose and that it does not violate. Heraclitus would have seen lamps like this every night of his life. The image was not imported from an abstract theoretical domain. It was available, material, carried in the ordinary visual texture of the world he moved through. What he added was not invention, but attention, the quality of attention that asks what this ordinary thing is actually doing, what it shows about the way the world arranges itself, whether the principle visible here in miniature is the same principle visible at every other scale, And what the flame showed him, looked at carefully enough, was the cosmos, not a metaphor for the cosmos, not a helpful illustration, the actual principle. The fire is the logos made visible in the smallest available format, a pattern of regulated exchange, kindling and going out in measures, maintaining form through the process of transformation, never at rest and never lost. Zeno had read this, Cleanthes had read this, Chrysippus had read this and followed every implication to its conclusion across hundreds of books, most of which are gone. Marcus Aurelius had read this and returned to it on the Danube frontier and in the palace at Rome and in the long nights of a reign that asked more of him than he felt fully equipped to give. What each of them found in the flame was not identical. Zeno found the rational substance threading through a cosmos that lives. Cleanthes found the God to address in prayer. Chrysippus found the seed of reason embedded in every formed thing. Marcus Aurelius found the steadying recognition that what passes is not being destroyed, it is being continued by different means, and all of them, returning by different paths, arrived at the same landscape that Heraclitus had named, a world organized by a principle that does not require our awareness of it to operate, but that becomes, when we do attend to it, a source of something the Stoics would eventually call apatheia, not the absence of feeling, but the freedom from being driven by feeling against the grain of how things actually go. Among the students who later encountered Stoic philosophy, the Stoicism that Zeno and his successors had built in part from Heraclitean fire, there were men who became governors, soldiers, advisors to emperors, teachers in provinces far from Athens. They carried the texts the way Zeno had carried the texts from Cyprus. The philosophy traveled in copies, in memory, in the repetition of particular phrases that had proved useful in difficult circumstances. Not because philosophy was a consolation, the Stoics were careful to distinguish themselves from those who offered consolation, which they regarded as a kind of dishonesty, but because the account of the cosmos as rationally ordered, and of the human being as a small but genuine instance of that rational order, provided a ground from which to act without being pulled off balance by every wind that moved. This is not a small thing, to act from a grounded position, in circumstances that have no interest in one's sense of balance, requires something more durable than courage. Courage depends on the moment and can run out. What the Logos provides in Heraclitus's original formulation, in Zeno's development of it, in Marcus Aurelius's daily return to it, is not courage but orientation. The fire burns in a direction. The exchanges happen in measures. The measures are not arbitrary. Knowing this, not merely believing it, but attending to it carefully enough that it becomes a quality of perception rather than an article of doctrine, this is what Heraclitus meant by waking up, and what the Stoics meant by living in accordance with nature, and what Marcus Aurelius meant when he returned, in his private notes, to the image of continuous mutation without loss of the ordering principle. The Stoic tradition eventually shaded into Neoplatonism and into early Christian theology, both of which found in the Logos something they needed for their own purposes. The Logos spermatikos of Chrysippus became in some early Christian readings the word that was in the beginning, not identical, not interchangeable, but close enough in shape to suggest that Heraclitean fire had found one more form in which to continue. The pattern persists. The material exchanges. What was kindled in a coastal city in the 6th century BCE went out in one form and kindled again in another, as Heraclitus might have said, since he had said approximately that about everything else. A student in Alexandria in the 3rd century, a city that contained more copies of more texts than anywhere else in the ancient world, a city lit at night by enough oil lamps that travelers approaching it from the sea could navigate by its glow, might have sat down with a scroll containing passages from Heraclitus, as quoted by Clement of Alexandria, who was quoting him for his own purposes, which were apologetic and theological, and not primarily philosophical. But the student might have read past Clement's purposes and arrived at the fragment itself, the fragment about the Logos being common, while the many live as if they had a private understanding, and the student might have paused. Not because the idea was new to them. Ideas in Alexandria circulated quickly and were rarely entirely new, but because something in the compression of the phrase required more than a single reading. The Logos is common, the Logos is common, and the many, which includes this student, sitting here with this scroll in this city. The many live as if they had a private understanding. The pause would have been a small one, a few seconds, no longer. Then the reading would have continued. But the pause is where the fragment had done its work. This is the quality Heraclitus was reaching for when he composed in the compressed, difficult style that earned him the epithet hos skotainos, the dark, the obscure. The difficulty was not carelessness and not obscurantism. It was the deliberate construction of a sentence that cannot be passed through quickly, a sentence that insists on the reader remaining inside its difficulty long enough for the difficulty to be felt rather than merely noted, because the Logos is not an idea that can be transferred from one mind to another by clear exposition. It is a quality of attention, and a sentence that requires a quality of attention to be read is, in this sense, a sentence that enacts what it describes. The darkness of Heraclitean prose is the darkness of a depth that has not been drained of its depth in order to be approached. Marcus Aurelius found it drainable only in the sense that it could be returned to, not understood once and then applied. Returned to. The flame does not burn once and then illuminate everything permanently. It burns now. It will burn again as long as it is tended, and the tending is the practice. He wrote in one of his late entries something that does not quote Heraclitus directly, but carries his entire weight. He wrote that the things of the body flow, and the things of the soul are smoke and dream, and life is a campaign, and the fame that follows is forgetting. He was not despairing. The sentence is not desperate. It is accurate in the way that a measurement is accurate, not flattering, not distressing, simply the thing as it is when looked at without adding anything the looker would prefer to find. And from accuracy, in the Stoic and Heraclitean tradition, comes not grief, but the opposite of grief, a specific kind of settled attention that finds the world sufficient to inhabit, because it has stopped asking the world to be something other than it is. The flame has been burning for hours, in the clay lamp, in the lamp that has no particular location or historical reference point, but exists wherever this image is being received. The wick has been drawing oil steadily, giving off its measured heat, holding its measured light. Nothing in it has been still for a moment since it was kindled. Nothing will be still until it goes out, and it will go out as all things go out in their measure. But the going out is not the end of the fire. It is the fire in its other form, the heat already dispersed into the air of the room, the light already gone forward, the oil already transformed into what light and warmth are when they leave a source and become part of the temperature of a larger world. The Logos does not require the lamp to know this. The process does not consult the flame. What Heraclitus offered, and what Zeno received, and what Chrysippus traced through 700 books, and what Marcus Aurelius returned to on the Danube frontier, and in the palace at night, and in the quiet of whatever solitude he could arrange, is not a requirement, but an invitation. The Logos is already moving through everything. It is already operating in measures, already maintaining the proportions, already kindling where it kindles, and going out where it goes out. The invitation is only to attend, to notice the exchange, to stop insisting on the stillness that has never been there and has never been needed. The flame that has been burning in this room, steady and unhurried, and neither consuming itself too quickly, nor losing its form. This flame does not achieve its character. It does not arrive at steadiness through effort or conclude its burning through resolution. It is simply what it is, fully, moment by moment, in the continuous exchange that constitutes its existence. And what Heraclitus was reaching toward, in the compressed darkness of his prose, in the fragments that survived through scribes and apologists and philosophers who needed him for their own purposes, what he was reaching toward was the recognition that the Logos is not something the mind achieves. It is something the mind, in its most open and unhurried moments, simply stops obscuring. In the stone room where he worked, Heraclitus turned a lyre over in his hands. It was a simple instrument by the standards of the Ionian coast, a tortoiseshell body, gut strings, a crossbar worn smooth where generations of thumbs had rested. The strings were slack. Someone had loosened them, perhaps to preserve the gut against a damp season, and the lyre sat in his hands the way a thing sits when it has been emptied of its purpose, present, material, and somehow incomplete. He tightened one string slowly, feeling the resistance build beneath his fingers, until the gut reached the exact point of tension at which a small movement of air would set it singing. Then he held it there, not releasing, not adding more, simply holding the string at the border between silence and sound, feeling the opposing forces, the string pulling inward, the frame pulling outward, each one asserting its nature against the other, and understanding, in that specific physical moment, something about the structure of everything. This is where the argument begins, not in abstraction, not in a school or a written dialogue. It begins in the weight of an instrument in a thinker's hands, and in the recognition that the tension is not the obstacle to the music, but the music's only possible source. Heraclitus had looked at the world as carefully as anyone who has ever lived, and what he saw was not the peaceful arrangement of things in their proper places that most of his contemporaries, taking their cue from the Olympian order, seemed to find reassuring. What he saw was opposition everywhere, day and night, hot and cold, wet and dry, the living and the dead, hunger and satiety, war and peace. And the great question was not how to resolve this opposition into something more stable and harmonious, but whether the apparent harmony that philosophers and priests kept reaching for was in fact already present inside the tension rather than waiting beyond it. The lyre answered the question before he had fully formed it. He set it down on the workbench, and the slack strings made no sound, and the tightened string made no sound either, because there was no one playing. But the difference between them was already a philosophical discovery. A lyre with no tension across its strings is not a lyre at rest. It is a lyre in a state of failure, a thing that has lost the condition of its own nature. The tension is not something applied to the lyre from outside. The tension is what the lyre is. He wrote, and the fragment has come to us through the centuries in a form compressed enough that scholars still disagree about its precise scope and meaning, that the world does not understand how, while differing from itself, it agrees with itself. He named the bow, he named the lyre, both objects whose entire identity, whose entire function, whose entire capacity to do what they do in the world, to send an arrow flying, to produce a sound that moves through the air and enters a listener and changes something in them, depends on the principle that genuine harmony is not the quiet settlement of a conflict, but its most refined and productive form. Hold the thought for a moment, because it is asking for something unusual. The ordinary account of harmony, the one inherited from several thousand years of domestic and political wishful thinking, says that harmony arrives when conflict ends. The strings of a lyre are in harmony when they are tuned and playing together. The citizens of a city are in harmony when they have stopped quarreling. A mind is at rest when the competing pulls of thought and fatigue and doubt and certainty have resolved themselves into something settled. But Heraclitus was proposing something different, and the lyre was his evidence. The strings of a lyre are in harmony precisely because they are in tension. Each string asserts itself against the frame. The frame asserts itself back. Neither yields. And in that mutual resistance, something arrives that neither the slack string nor the broken string could ever produce, a sound, a tone, a thing of beauty, built entirely from the productive refusal of opposites to become one another. This is the unity of opposites, and the name is almost too tidy for what he was pointing at. It sounds like a position, a thesis, a line one adopts in a debate. But the experience of it, the full, living, felt encounter with what he was pointing at, is closer to the moment when a piece of music one has been listening to, without quite hearing, suddenly becomes audible all the way through, and the dissonances that seemed like imperfections reveal themselves as what the resolution needed in order to arrive. An archer stands in the gray light before a city gate, drawing a bow. The bow has been shaped from wood of a particular density, seasoned over several years until it holds its curve without cracking. The bowstring is taut. As the archer draws, the resistance in the arm is not something to be overcome. It is the bow's nature asserting itself, the wood's reluctance to leave its resting curve, the string's reluctance to stretch further from its settled length. Every increment of draw increases the resistance. The archer feels it up through the fingers and the wrist and the shoulder, a force pressing back against the draw with exactly the same magnitude as the draw itself. And at the point of full draw, the moment just before release, the bow and the archer are in a state of perfect mutual productive opposition, each one the condition of the other's power, each one requiring what the other is pushing back with. Then the arrow flies, and the harmony of the bow, its achievement, the thing it was made for, exists entirely in that fraction of a second at which the tension becomes motion, not before, not after. The bow is most fully a bow at the moment of its greatest internal opposition. Heraclitus was writing about this and about the world. He was not writing about bows as illustrations for a separate argument about something else. The bow and the lyre were not chosen because they were vivid examples of an abstract principle. They were chosen because they are the principle made available to the hand and the ear, because in objects that carry tension visibly and functionally, it becomes possible to feel what it would otherwise take years of abstract reasoning to approach. The fragment most often placed alongside the bow and lyre is one that pushes the argument further into territory that has made readers uneasy for 25 centuries. Immortals are mortal, Heraclitus wrote, and mortals immortal, living each other's death, dying each other's life. The phrasing is deliberate in its difficulty. He is not offering consolation. He is not saying that something of us persists, or that the divine shares our sorrows, or that the cycle of death and birth constitutes a form of continuity we should find comforting. He is making a metaphysical claim about the structure of opposites at the scale of existence itself, that life and death are not two distinct conditions, separated by an event, but two aspects of a single continuous process in which neither can be defined or even be what it is without the other. The argument is cold in the way that clear water is cold, not hostile, not harsh, but simply at a temperature that has nothing to do with what one might prefer. A living thing is something metabolizing, burning in measured quantities, drawing in what is outside itself, and releasing what is inside, moment by moment consuming the conditions of its own continuation, in order to keep continuing. In this sense, every living thing is always dying, and the dying is not a failure of the living, but its mechanism. The flame of a lamp is not surviving in spite of consuming the oil. It is surviving by consuming the oil. The consumption is the continuity. At the other end of the pairing, something that has died becomes the nutrient from which new living things draw their continuation. The soil that receives what was once alive returns it, over decades and centuries, into forms of life that could not have come into being without that material. The thing that has died is not gone. It has entered the process from which living things are built. In this sense, what has died is the source from which the living are perpetually regenerated. Living, in Heraclitus's formulation, each other's death. This is not consolation, but it is also not despair. It is something more difficult and more stable than either, an account of what existence actually is, held at the philosophical distance that the Heraclitean tradition tends to maintain, a distance not from care, but from the kind of urgency that distorts what one is looking at. There is another fragment in which Heraclitus turns this opposition toward time itself. The god, he wrote, is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and hunger. The god changes, he added, the way fire changes when it is mixed with spices, and is named according to the scent of each of them. The image is careful. Fire mixed with incense does not cease to be fire. It takes on the qualities of what it encounters, the scent, the color of the smoke, the rate of the burn, while remaining, in its nature, fire. The divine, by this account, is not one thing opposed by another thing, but the process in which all things cycle through their opposites, while remaining, at a level beneath those opposites, one continuous event. Day and night are not two different things that replace each other. They are the same thing, the cycle of light, at two different moments in its turning. The moment of dawn is not the victory of day over night. It is the exact point at which day and night are simultaneously present. The sky holding both colors at once, the birds beginning to call before there is enough light to see them, the temperature neither one nor the other. Heraclitus was saying that this threshold, the moment of maximum simultaneous opposition, is not an anomaly in the structure of things. It is the structure of things, and what we usually call day or night, or summer or winter, or peace or war, are simply the points on the cycle far enough from the threshold that the opposition has temporarily become less visible. The threshold is always there. The philosopher's work is to learn to see it. Here it becomes possible to understand why a philosopher writing in 19th century Jena, in a city that was about to become the site of one of the most consequential battles of European history, found in Heraclitus not a historical curiosity, but a living grammar for what he was trying to think. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was composing the final pages of his Phenomenology of Spirit in October of 1806 as the French army moved through the streets of Jena below his window. He saw Napoleon ride through the city, or at least recorded the impression, in a letter written the next day of having seen him, and described the experience as witnessing the world spirit on horseback. history itself taking visible form in the body of one man. The old Holy Roman Empire was dissolving. The political order of a continent was changing faster than language could follow it. And Hegel was writing a book about the movement of thought through opposition and reconciliation, a book that would eventually shape the whole subsequent history of European philosophy, a book for which he would declare, with complete seriousness, that there was no proposition of Heraclitus he had not incorporated into his own logic. This is not a small claim. Hegel's system is enormous, a sustained attempt to think through the entire movement of consciousness, history, nature, and spirit as a single developing whole. The ambition of the project is architectural, in a way that makes the Heraclitean fragments scattered across the page seem like something quite different in kind. But Hegel knew what the fragments were doing, and what they were doing was naming the mechanism he was trying to build a system around. The movement through contradiction toward a higher unity that preserves and transcends the contradicting terms. In Hegel's dialectic, the thesis and antithesis do not simply oppose each other the way two armies oppose each other across a field. They require each other. The thesis generates its antithesis by its own internal logic, by being so fully itself that it produces the conditions for its opposite. In the resolution of the two, the synthesis is not a compromise or a midpoint, but a new level of understanding that could not have been reached without the full passage through both terms. The bow and the lyre are already there in this structure, recognizable to anyone who has held the fragment alongside the system. Hegel constructs a cathedral where Heracliteans gives a doorway, and both of them are pointing through the same opening. But Hegel's inheritance of the Heraclitean insight also transformed it in ways that Heraclitus would not necessarily have endorsed. The dialectic in Hegel's hands tends toward a goal, toward absolute spirit, toward the full self-consciousness of mind coming to know itself through history. There is a direction, there is an arrival. The contradiction is always in service of a resolution that will eventually, over the long arc of historical development, complete itself. Heraclitus offers no such arrival. The fire kindling in measures and going out in measures is not building toward a final state. The river is not flowing toward a destination at which it will stop being a river and become something else. The tension of the bow is not preliminary to a state in which tension will no longer be necessary. The opposites require each other not temporarily, not as stages in a process that will eventually leave them behind, but permanently, constitutively, as the very condition of there being anything at all. This is the place where the two thinkers diverge, and the place where Heraclitus remains, in certain respects more difficult to hold than Hegel, because the Heraclitean world offers no final harmony waiting ahead of the current tension. The tension is the harmony, not a bridge to something else, the thing itself. Aristotle, who came 2 centuries before Hegel and read Heraclitus in a form more complete than anything available now, was troubled by the unity of opposites for a different reason. In the Metaphysics, Aristotle argued that Heraclitus could not have genuinely believed that the same thing both is and is not at the same time. The principle of non-contradiction, the rule that no thing can both possess and not possess the same property in the same respect at the same time, was for Aristotle not merely a rule of logic, but the most fundamental condition of rational discourse and of reality itself. Without it, no statement could be true, no distinction could hold, no argument could proceed. Aristotle read the unity of opposites as a violation of this principle, and concluded, with the confidence of a philosopher who had built a very large logical system, that Heraclitus must have meant something weaker than he said perhaps that opposites succeed one another in time, or that they appear differently from different perspectives, but not that they are genuinely the same in the same respect at the same moment. It is a serious objection. Aristotle was rarely careless. But it may also be that Aristotle was applying a logical framework built for the analysis of stable objects to a philosopher whose primary claim was precisely that no objects are fully stable, that the Aristotelian analysis of things in terms of fixed properties, present or absent, is itself a kind of abstraction from the more fundamental flow of processes in which those properties are always in formation. Philosophers working in the 20th and 21st centuries on the problems of paraconsistent logic, the study of logical systems that can tolerate some contradictions without collapsing into incoherence, have returned to this question with new tools. Graham Priest, among others, has argued at length that there are genuine cases in which something both is and is not in the same respect, and that Aristotelian logic, rather than being the neutral description of how reality must be, is instead one logical framework among others, carrying its own assumptions and its own limits. Whether Heraclitus himself was gesturing towards something like this, whether he was making a technical logical claim, or something closer to a phenomenological observation about the structure of experienced reality, remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the question has not been settled. Aristotle's objection has not dissolved the unity of opposites. The unity of opposites has not dissolved Aristotle's logic. The two positions have been living alongside each other for 2,500 years, each one finding the other insufficient, each one pointing towards something the other seems unable to see. This is not a failure of the inquiry. It is the inquiry, which is to say, it is the tension, which is to say, it is the bow, fully drawn, still holding. There is a passage in Heraclitus that sits among the opposition fragments, like something slightly different in kind, less argumentative, more quietly observational, as though the philosopher had paused the philosophical reasoning and allowed himself a moment of description. The cold things become warm, he wrote. The warm grows cold, the wet dries, the parched becomes moist. This is not the unity of opposites as logical paradox. It is the unity of opposites as witnessed fact, the most ordinary thing in the world, dressed plainly without ceremony, presented not as conclusion, but as evidence of something that anyone who has attended to a single day has already seen without noticing what they were seeing. A fire goes out in the morning, the ash cools through the afternoon, the rain comes, the ash absorbs the water, the wet earth warms the following day in the sun, the warmth dries the earth again, the dry earth splits, into the cracks the seeds of a plant descend, the plant grows in the warmth. Nothing in this sequence is anomalous. Nothing requires special explanation or unusual observation. The sequence is the most common thing in the world, and Heraclitus is pointing at it and saying this is what the bow and the lyre are about. This is the unity of opposites at the scale of the afternoon. Look at how thoroughly the world declines to stay as it is, and look at how thoroughly, in that declining, it remains entirely itself. The argument has a quality, held long enough, of gradually dissolving the sense that there is anything to argue. Not because it becomes obvious, it does not become obvious, but because it begins to feel less like a position one adopts, and more like something one either sees or does not see. The way the current beneath the surface of a river is either visible to someone who has learned to read moving water or invisible to someone who has not. Once it is visible, it cannot easily be made invisible again. Near the end of his working life, or at least in what scholars read as the later, more austere registers of his surviving fragments, Heraclitus turned the unity of opposites inward toward the question of the self. The self, by the same logic that governs rivers and fires and bows, is not a fixed substance persisting beneath the flow of experience. It is a pattern held in tension. The man who wakes in the morning is not the same man who went to sleep, and not entirely different either. He is a river, the same river, different water, the identity real, and the sameness a specific kind of sameness that allows for complete material renewal without the loss of the recognizable form. What holds the pattern together is not some unchanging substrate, but the logos, the rational structure running through all things, of which any given self is a particular and temporary configuration. This is a difficult thought to hold with equanimity. The Aristotelian in anyone protests, there must be something that is simply, unambiguously me, something that the change happens to, rather than something that simply is the change. But Heraclitus is patient with the protest, and goes no further than the river. The river is unambiguously a river. Ask what it is made of at any given moment, and the answer is water that was elsewhere yesterday and will be elsewhere tomorrow. Ask what makes it a river, and the answer is not the water, but the pattern, the banks, the gradient, the rate of flow, the way it responds to rain and drought, the particular sound it makes over this particular configuration of stones. The pattern is real. The pattern has a name. The river is the pattern, not the water, and the pattern is sustained entirely by the process that appears from the outside to be threatening it. This is the thought Heraclitus is asking us to extend, quietly, to the thing that is lying here in the dark, thinking and resting and feeling the day's weight ease away, not the atoms of the body which have been replaced many times over, not the specific content of the thoughts which change with every hour, something more like the particular manner in which a self meets the world, its quality of attention, its characteristic way of being pulled between rest and wakefulness, silence and thought, which is itself attention, itself a lyre string, itself a bow under draw. The thought does not need to be resolved. Resolution was never what the bow was for. Through the centuries following Heraclitus, the unity of opposites has been returned to by thinkers who arrived at it from very different directions, and each return confirms something about the original, not that it was right in some final approving sense, but that it was pointing at something patient enough to wait for them. The Neoplatonic tradition, working through Plotinus in the 3rd century of the Common Era, built elaborate architectures of hierarchical unity in which all opposites converge as one descends from multiplicity toward the one, a different topology from Heraclitus, but driven by the same recognition that the separateness of opposed things requires explanation. The medieval mystics, working within traditions of negative theology that described the divine as beyond all opposition, were reaching for something structurally similar from the other direction, arguing that the divine is neither day nor night, neither warm nor cold, neither being nor non-being, but the condition within which all those opposites become possible. And Heraclitus, without the theological commitment, without the mystical program, in a fragmentary prose written in an Ionian city 2,500 years ago, had said, "The god is day and night," and named the fire. The bow unstrung, laid flat across 2 hands, it is still curved. Years of use have taught the wood a shape, the long bend through the grain that took months of seasoning and slow, careful working to achieve. The asymmetry that makes one limb slightly stronger than the other to compensate for the archer's draw. No string is across it now. Nothing holds the tips apart and the handle back. The tension has been released and the bow lies quiet, but the wood has not forgotten. The curve that was drawn into it by its making and its use is still there in the grain, still visible to anyone who knows what a bow is for, still ready, given a string, given a hand to draw it, given something worth sending forward into the world to become again what it most fully is. A thing built to hold opposites together does not lose its nature when the opposition rests. The bow at ease is still a bow. The lyre unplayed still carries in its frame the disposition toward music, the specific curve of tension that even in silence marks it as something designed for a particular kind of productive resistance. And a mind that has genuinely held the unity of opposites, not as a philosophical opinion one adopts, but as something actually seen in the physical structure of a bow, or the actual sound of a lyre, or the actual coldness of new water arriving at the ankle in a river, does not lose that seeing when it sets the thought down and grows still. The thought rests, the bow rests, the river continues, unhurried, in the dark beyond the argument, doing what it does without anyone watching, the pattern intact, the water moving, the identity of it real and held, and entirely without urgency. Heraclitus wrote one work. It was deposited in the temple at Ephesus, according to Diogenes Laertius, perhaps so that only the worthy few would trouble themselves to read it, or perhaps because a temple was the one place in the city that might keep a text safe across the turbulence of the following decades. The work is gone. What remains are fragments, quoted out of their original sequence by later writers, who had their own purposes and their own contexts, each one preserving a piece of something that has not been whole for more than 2,000 years. And yet the fragments have not lost their nature. They are, in their scattered and incomplete form, still doing exactly what Heraclitus said all things do, maintaining their identity through the continuous replacement of their context, persisting as pattern across the centuries of change that have carried them here. Each fragment is a bow laid across different hands in different centuries, still curved, still carrying in its grain the disposition towards something that requires tension to become audible. The incompleteness is real, the loss is real, and the pattern compressed, deliberate, pointing at something too large and too pervasive to be said simply, is real as well. Two things at once, always two things at once. The bow that is most fully a bow at the moment of its greatest opposition, the string that produces music only when it cannot relax, the river that is most unambiguously itself when the water moving through it is least like the water that was there before, the thinker who, having really looked at a lyre, found in its tension not a problem to be solved, but a structure to be recognized, the structure of the world held in two hands, still and curved, waiting in the quiet for the conditions that will make it sing. Montaigne climbed the stairs slowly. The stone steps of his tower were worn unevenly, smooth at the center from years of the same ascending foot, and the candle he carried threw his shadow large and wavering against the curved wall. It was sometime in the 1570s, the wars of religion still burning through the French countryside beyond his windows, the world outside the chateau arranged in the familiar pattern of men destroying what they claimed to love. He had with him, tucked under one arm, a slim collection of translated Greek fragments, among them several passages attributed to a philosopher from Ephesus who had been dead for 2,000 years. He set the candle on the table. He sat down. Outside, the night was complete. What Montaigne found in those fragments was something he had already suspected about himself. He had been trying for several years to write a book about his own thoughts, and the project kept doing something strange. The thoughts kept changing. A view he had held with confidence in the spring would look different by autumn, not because new information had arrived, but because he had changed, quietly and without announcement, the way water changes temperature. He had begun to wonder whether a book about a self could ever be finished, given that the self would not hold still long enough to be fully described. The fragments from Ephesus told him that this was not a failure of his method, it was the nature of the thing. He wrote, eventually, that he does not paint being, but passage. He wrote that his book and himself are one and the same thing, both in continuous alteration. These sentences are not decorative. They are structural. The essay form itself, which does not argue toward a conclusion, but circles and returns and qualifies and extends, is a literary enactment of the idea that the self observed is always already a different self from the one who began the observation. Montaigne had not solved this problem. He had found a way to write that did not require it to be solved, a form that could hold change as its subject and its method simultaneously, a river that describes its own flowing. The Tower Library, where he composed the essays, had sentences painted on its ceiling beams. He had chosen them himself. Inscriptions from Sextus Empiricus and Ecclesiastes and others hung above his head like the persistent questions of every tradition he had lived inside. Some of those sentences came from the Heraclitean inheritance, filtered through later writers, the same chain of transmission that carries all of these ideas forward. One thinker quoting another, the words arriving across centuries, slightly worn from the handling, but still, at their center, carrying something that holds. He sat beneath those sentences and wrote in a language still warm from civil war, finding in the act of honest self-description a philosophical practice that required no fixed destination, no final self, no arrival. The essay, as Montaigne left it, does not end. It continues in the sense that any river continues, not because the same water keeps moving, but because the pattern of movement persists. A reader who opens the essays today enters a mind in motion that has not stopped moving, whose author is simultaneously the most present and most absent voice in the room, saying from an enormous distance, "Nothing in me is settled, and this is not a confession, but an observation, and the observation itself is already changing." There is a particular quality of attention that certain philosophical traditions have cultivated in response to the recognition that things do not hold still. It is not the anxious tracking of a mind trying not to lose something. It is quieter than that, more like the attention of someone who has decided to watch the water instead of trying to collect it. In a monastery in northern Thailand, a young monk sits before dawn on a stone floor. His eyes are half closed. Around him, the night is retreating through the high open windows, the dark becoming something more complicated than dark as the first gray enters. He is watching his thoughts arise and pass, and he is doing this the way a patient person watches fish surface in a pond, not reaching toward them, not naming them, simply allowing each one to appear and dissolve back into what produced it. The teaching he is practicing has a word for what he is observing, anicca. It means impermanence, and it is one of 3 marks that Theravada Buddhist teaching identifies as characteristic of all conditioned phenomena, all the things that arise from causes and pass away when causes change. The teaching does not present this as melancholy news. It presents it as the basic structure of what is, and it suggests that the suffering woven through ordinary experience comes not from impermanence itself, but from the habitual refusal to see things as they are, the clinging, the insistence that what is passing should stay, the investment of permanent trust in arrangements that are, by their nature, temporary. The monk on the stone floor is not practicing despair. He is practicing the specific form of peace that becomes available when the clinging has been for a moment released. The structural parallel to what Heraclitus saw at the Caister River is close enough to be worth holding quietly. Both observations begin with the same basic perception. Things are not stable, and this is not an accident or a failure, but the condition of existence itself. Both observations diagnose ordinary human awareness as somehow missing this, caught in the habitual assumption that what seems stable is stable, that what seems permanent has earned its permanence, and both suggest that a more accurate perception of things, entered into with the quality of attention the teaching requires, does not produce dread, but produces something closer to its opposite, a loosening of the grip on what was never in the hand. The differences are real and worth respecting. The Buddhist tradition is oriented, finally, toward the cessation of suffering. The contemplative practice is a path, and it leads somewhere. Heraclitus was making a cosmological claim, not prescribing a path. He was saying something about what the world is, not primarily about what to do with the knowledge. These are different intentions emerging from different forms of life, and the resonance between them does not dissolve that difference. What remains after the difference is acknowledged is a shared recognition, arrived at from opposite ends of the known world, that the river has always been moving, and that the cost of pretending otherwise is paid continuously in the small currency of misdirected expectation. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu and composed somewhere in the 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era, uses a different image entirely for the unnamed pattern that moves through everything. Where Heraclitus reaches for fire, consuming, transforming, self-sustaining, always exchanging one thing for another at the exact measure that preserves its form, the Tao Te Ching reaches for water. Water does not burn, it does not consume, it yields. It finds the lowest place and settles there. It shapes stone not by opposing it, but by passing over it 10,000 times, and the stone gives way without the water having insisted. Where Heraclitean fire commands respect through intensity, Taoist water invites something softer, a willingness to go where the shape of things directs, to not insist on a direction that the world has not already provided. And yet both traditions are pointing from opposite directions toward the same hidden ground. The Tao is not visible to ordinary perception. It is the pattern beneath the patterns, the movement within the stillness, the name that cannot be said without already failing to name the thing. The Logos is not visible to those who have not learned to look past the surface of their habitual opinions. It is common to all, and yet each person lives as if their private interpretation were sufficient. Both traditions say there is something moving through everything, and you will not find it by looking harder at the surface. Both traditions say the ordinary modes of attention are not wrong exactly, but they are partial, and the partiality has a cost. Both traditions reach toward the same river from different banks, with different tools, in different weather. What Lao Tzu valued in water was its willingness to give life without striving for recognition. It nourishes the 10,000 things and does not compete with them. It goes to the places that other things avoid. And this lowness, this patient yielding, is presented as a form of power that assertive force cannot achieve. There is something here that Heraclitus, the proud philosopher who declined the king's invitation and condemned his fellow citizens for their blindness, might have found uncongenial. Heraclitus had no patience for yielding. His fire burns because it must, and it measures its exchanges not out of humility, but out of the necessity of cosmic order. The Logos is not gentle, it is precise, and yet the pattern it names, the hidden unity that holds all opposites together, the measure that governs all exchange. This is the same pattern the Tao Te Ching is reaching for with softer hands. It is the nature of the deepest perceptions to arrive by multiple routes. William James was sitting at a desk in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1890, surrounded by the peculiar controlled chaos of an academic whose correspondence has not been filed in several months, with a manuscript on the table before him that was already overdue and already twice the length originally requested and still not finished. The book was called The Principles of Psychology, and it was attempting something genuinely difficult to describe the mind from the inside, not as a collection of static elements, but as it actually presents itself in experience, which is as something that moves. James had been looking for a phrase that would capture this, and he had found one, and he knew as he wrote it down that it was right in the way that images are sometimes right before the arguments for them have been assembled. Stream of consciousness. He set the phrase down carefully. He was aware it was an image. He was aware that images do him more work here than technical definitions could, because the technical vocabulary of contemporary psychology kept implying that mental life is composed of distinct units, sensations, perceptions, ideas, arranged in sequence like beads on a string. But that, James had decided, is not what mental life is like from the inside. From the inside, it is continuous. It flows. It has no clear joints, no moments where one thought ends and another cleanly begins. The transitions are as real as the things they connect, and the relations between ideas are themselves experienced, not merely inferred. The same thought, James argued, never truly recurs. What returns is always a slightly different version, carrying the trace of everything that has happened since the first occurrence. He was following, without perhaps fully knowing it, a channel that had been cut 2,500 years earlier. The river fragment, in its most careful form, does not say the river is entirely different from moment to moment. It says that different, and again, different waters are flowing through it, while the river itself persists. James was saying something structurally parallel about the mind. Different, and again, different contents are flowing through it, while the stream continues. The identity is in the continuity of the flowing, not in any fixed element that persists unchanged through the process. This is not a coincidence of phrasing. It is a convergence of two careful observers looking at the same phenomenon. One at a river in Ephesus, one at the moving content of a human mind in Massachusetts, and arriving at the same structural account. What James added, through the methods of his own tradition, was the insistence that relations and transitions are as real as the objects they connect. When ordinary language and ordinary psychology described the mind, they tended to describe the solid objects, the ideas, the impressions, the sensations, and treat the movement between them as nothing, as mere empty passage. James said, the passage is not nothing. The feeling of transition is as real as the feeling of arrival. The moment of relation between two thoughts is experienced, not merely implied. And this insistence on the reality of process, on the substantiality of movement itself, is exactly what makes the river a river rather than a collection of water samples taken at intervals. The current is not an absence between the drops. He had read Heraclitus. He had read the fragments in the way a careful thinker reads an ancestor, not to be confirmed by them, not to be corrected by them, but to find in their thinking the structure of a problem he is already living with, and to see how an older mind held it. What he found was not a system he could borrow, but a quality of attention he could recognize. The attention of someone who had looked at the world's instability long enough that the instability itself had become the most interesting thing, not a problem to be solved, but a structure to be understood, and in understanding lived with more honestly. There is a way of thinking about the Stoic tradition that positions it as the practical discipline built on Heraclitean ground. Zeno of Citium had carried the fire logos into the streets of Athens and made it walk. He had asked if the universe is governed by a rational ordering principle, and if human beings are part of the universe, then what follows for how a human being should live? The answer the Stoics developed over several generations was elegant in its simplicity: live in accordance with nature, which is to say, in accordance with the rational principle that orders all things, which is to say, in accordance with the Logos, and this alignment is not theoretical. It is practiced daily in the attention brought to each event, each loss, each morning's work. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his tent on the Danube frontier in the 2nd century of the Common Era, did not write for publication. The meditations were private notes, reminders he wrote to himself, because he kept forgetting, kept slipping back into the habitual patterns of resentment, preference, the desire that things be otherwise. He was the most powerful man in the known world, and he found the work of being human more difficult than governing an empire. He returned again and again in those private pages to the Heraclitean observation that all things are in flux, that the world changes, that the self changes, that the people who have been admired are gone, and the people who admired them are gone, and the very ground of their existence has shifted. He returned to this not to produce despair, but to loosen, one more time, the grip of preference. If everything changes, then the loss of any particular thing is not a departure from the natural order, but an expression of it. And if loss is an expression of the natural order, then the correct response is not resistance, but a clear-eyed return to what remains, the present moment, the work at hand, the quality of attention brought to whatever is here now. This is the Stoic practice of memento mori, the deliberate contemplation of impermanence, the vivifying awareness that what is present is passing, and it is philosophically downstream from the Heraclitean river in the most direct sense. The river told Heraclitus something true about the world. The Stoics took that truth and asked what follows for a life. Marcus Aurelius answered that question in the only way available to him, not with arguments, but with the daily practice of returning, again and again, to the recognition until the recognition began to shape the quality of his days. What is notable, reading those private pages, is how little dread they carry. There is difficulty in them, and honest acknowledgement of failure, and the fatigue of someone who has been practicing a discipline for decades, and still finds it necessary to begin again each morning. But there is no theater of despair, no performance of crisis in the face of transience. The tone is something closer to the tone of a craftsman who knows the work is never finished and has made peace with that, who returns to the bench each morning, not because the work will be completed, but because the returning is itself the thing of value. The meditations are, in this sense, a form of philosophical practice that the river makes possible. Because everything flows, the only honest response is not to try to stop the flowing, but to attend to it as clearly as possible, to not invest the stability of one's equanimity in arrangements that the river will dissolve, to find instead the ground that holds even when the water moves. The Stoics called this ground the rational order, the logos, the ordering principle that persists through all change as the river persists through all the different waters it carries. To stand on that ground is not to escape the river. It is to understand what the river is and to stop being surprised when it moves. The tradition carries forward in forms the original thinkers could not have anticipated. A novelist in the 20th century structures an entire book as a single day in the mind of a man walking through Dublin, the prose following the stream of consciousness in such precise detail that the joins between thoughts are invisible, the mind moving from the taste of a kidney in the morning to the Odyssey to the particular quality of light on a summer Thursday in 1904, everything connected to everything else by the private logic of association, nothing lost, nothing fixed, the whole construction, a river that runs for several hundred pages and ends appropriately without a period. The river fragments, which Heraclitus set down in compressed and difficult prose, designed to resist easy consumption, find their way, 2,500 years later, into a literary form that enacts their logic with unprecedented thoroughness, a book that cannot be stepped into in the same way twice, because the reader is always different from the reader who began it. A physicist in the 20th century looks at the equations describing the behavior of subatomic particles and notices something that should perhaps not be surprising, given everything that has come before. The most fundamental level of physical reality that the equations can describe is not composed of stable substances, but of events, interactions, the passing of quantum states through one another. The particle itself is better described as a pattern of activity than as a thing. Process ontology, the philosophical position that events and relations are more fundamental than substances, is not a metaphor. It is, at this level of description, the structure the equations require. Heraclitus did not know about quantum mechanics, but he had looked at a river and seen what the river was doing, and what the river was doing, it turns out, goes all the way down. None of this is to say that the traditions are one tradition, or that the observations converge on a single truth. All of them were groping toward. The style guide for honest intellectual history requires that each position be taken seriously on its own terms, and each of these traditions has its own terms, its own concerns, its own understanding of what the observation of flux is for. The Buddhist monk on the stone floor is doing something different from Marcus Aurelius in the tent. Montaigne in the tower is doing something different from William James at the desk. What they share is not a conclusion but a starting point, the recognition that the surface of things is not all of things, that what seems fixed is moving, and that honest attention to the moving reveals something that fixed attention misses. The full weight of what they share is not felt in the statement of it. It is felt, if it is felt at all, in the quality of attention that prolonged acquaintance with it produces, a loosening, a settling, a gradual willingness to let the river be a river rather than demanding that it stand still long enough to be measured. The practice is the same practice, whether it takes place in Ephesus or Athens or a Thai monastery or a tower in Perigord or a Cambridge study. It is the practice of looking at what is actually there, rather than at what the habit of preference has arranged for the eyes to see. There is a kind of rest available in this, not the rest of a problem solved, or a question answered, or a position secured against revision, a different kind of rest, the rest of having stopped fighting the basic conditions of the thing. The river is moving, it has always been moving. Every attempt to hold it still has already failed before it began, not because the attempt was poorly made, but because stillness was never the river's nature to offer. And in the recognition of this, fully entered rather than merely acknowledged, something releases that had been held in place by the effort of insisting otherwise. Montaigne wrote the essays over approximately 20 years, and in that time he changed his mind about many things, including things he had changed his mind about before. The book is full of revisions he did not bother to remove, passages where he contradicts a position he held 2 chapters earlier, without explanation, without apology, because the point was never consistency. The point was honesty. And the most honest account of a mind over 20 years is a mind that has moved and moved again and will move again and has stopped treating the movement as a failure of rigor. The book is complete in the sense that it covers a great deal of ground. It is incomplete in the sense that its author was still alive and still thinking when the last edition was printed, and the version that exists is simply the one that the press made permanent before the river had finished. What the river does not do is mourn its own passage. This is, in some ways, the deepest observation available in the long tradition of thought that stretches from Ephesus to Cambridge to the stone floor before dawn. The river does not wish it were a lake. It does not regret the water that has passed through it. It does not pause over the particular configuration it held yesterday and grieve its loss. The river simply moves, and the moving is what makes it the thing it is, the particular river with its particular character, recognizable across all its changes, precisely because the changes are consistent with its nature. A person coming to this recognition, late in a long day, in the particular state of fatigue and quiet that belongs to the hours before sleep, finds it settling in a different register than it would at noon. The arguments are the same, the history is the same, the river is the same river. But at this hour, the body has already begun the process of releasing the day, the accumulated positions, the maintained resistances, the careful self-monitoring that waking life requires, and the mind is following, more slowly, into the same letting go. The philosophy and the physiology of sleep are doing the same thing at this hour. Both of them are asking, what happens when the insistence stops? The answer the Heraclitean tradition has been working toward, in all its forms across all its centuries, is not dramatic. It does not arrive with the feeling of a problem solved. It arrives, when it arrives at all, as a gradual recognition that the river has been carrying everything all along. The arguments, the images, the thinkers at their desks and their stone floors, the fragments preserved by scribes who did not know what they were preserving, the river itself, and whatever it is that watches the river and wonders at it, all of it in the current, all of it moving, none of it lost in the way that permanence would have required things to be in order to be truly held. Somewhere a river is running in the dark. This is not metaphor. Somewhere tonight there is an actual river, the Caister perhaps, or the Meander, which flows in the same corner of the world, or the Tiber, or the Seine below Montaigne's country, or the Charles near where James sat at his desk. And it is running in complete darkness, unseen by anyone, making the sounds rivers make when no one is listening, moving precisely as fast as its gradient and its channel require, neither rushing nor withholding, maintaining the identity that consists entirely in the continuity of its movement. The water in it now will not be the water in it at dawn. The water at dawn will not be the water in it by afternoon. And yet the river will be the same river, recognizable, nameable, the particular river that it is, holding its character through all the different waters it carries forward into the dark and beyond. The trees on its banks have dropped into sleep the way the trees drop into sleep, which is to say quietly and without announcement, their leaves stilling in the windless air, their roots moving imperceptibly through the soil in the continuous slow work that roots perform outside the range of any observation. The stars, where they are visible above the water, move so slowly that only the accumulated hours reveal it, an arc too gradual for the eye to catch, the whole sky turning on its long pivot without hurry. The river does not notice any of this. It is not watching the stars. It is not attending to the trees. It is simply doing what it does, receiving what comes to it, and releasing it downstream, neither holding nor refusing, the current steady and dark and full of the quiet that comes when something has been doing what it is for long enough that the doing and the being are no longer distinct. Somewhere in the long chain of transmission, from the philosopher to the scribe, to the commentator, to the copier, to the printed page, to the reader in a tower, to the reader at a desk, to the student on a stone floor, to whoever carries the observation forward next, somewhere in that chain, the essential thing survives, not unchanged, never unchanged, but surviving the way the river survives the passage of all its water, the way the flame survives the consumption of all its fuel, the way a thought survives the continuous alteration of the mind that thinks it by being the kind of thing whose identity is in the movement rather than despite it. The night is quiet now. The arguments have been made and can rest. The river is still running in the dark outside the range of any attending. The breath has slowed. The weight of the body has settled more completely into what supports it.